When the American merchant ship the Mary Celeste was found drifting, deserted in the Atlantic Ocean on December 4th, 1872, it became one of the most perplexing mysteries in maritime history. The ship was discovered in astonishingly good condition, with all of its cargo and personal effects completely undisturbed after leaving New York Harbor on November 7th for Genoa, Italy. However, the whole crew was mysteriously gone. There were a lot of wild theories and conjectures about the terrifying scene and the lack of distress signals, which led people to suspect everything from mutiny and piracy to natural disasters like water spouts or even unexpected earthquakes. Mystery surrounds the fate of the crew, and no conclusive explanation has been found despite thorough investigations. This event, of course, has continued to fascinate authors, historians, and the general public, and it solidifies the Mary Celeste's position as a symbol of mysterious maritime disappearances. It continues to pique interest in both academic discussions and popular culture. And welcome to the channel. Today we're, I suppose, doing a bit of a mystery video. It's a historical mystery, I suppose. Once again, best way to support the channel is just to enjoy it, and I hope you learn something. But if you feel like clicking the like and subscribe and leaving a comment, certainly helps the algorithm tell other people. Now, let's all get nice and relaxed, and we can begin. And so the story begins at Joshua Dewey's shipyard in the Nova Scotian village of Spencer's Island, where the keel of the future Mary Celeste was laid in late 1860. The ship was Carvel built, with the hull blanking flush rather than overlapping, and was rigged as a brigantine. It had 2 masts, and all of the timber was locally felled. Eventually it was launched in the year 1861, May the 18th, and was registered at neighboring Parsborough on June 10th, 1861. But it wasn't called the Mary Celeste first. Originally, it was called the Amazon. According to the original registration documents, she was 99 feet long and 25.5 feet in width, with 11.7 feet in depth and weighing approximately 198 gross tons. There was a local group of 9 people, led by Dewis, her owner. Robert McClellan, the ship's first captain, was also one of the co-owners. And so in June of 1861, the Amazon set sail on her first voyage, sailing to 5 different islands: Nova Scotia to load up on timber for the journey to London across the Atlantic. Captain McClellan unfortunately became ill after the ship's initial loading, and his condition deteriorated. On June the 19th, the Amazon made its way back to Spencer's Island, where McClellan passed away. After taking over as captain, John Nutting Parker continued the journey to London, during which the Amazon experienced more bad luck. You see, after departing London, she ran into and sank a brig in the English Channel after colliding with fishing gear in the narrows of Eastport, Maine. For the 2 years that Parker was in charge, the Amazon focused mostly on trade in the West Indies. In November of 1861, she traveled across the Atlantic to France, where she was once again painted, possibly by the renowned maritime artist Honoré de Pellegrin of the Marseille School. Parker was replaced in 1863 by one William Thompson, and he held the position until 1867. He commented on the original voyagers. "We went to the West Indies, England, and the Mediterranean, what we call the foreign trade. Not a single unusual thing happened." Bit of a foreshadowing, isn't it? Quiet years. Smooth sailing, if we are to use the analogy. But in October of 1867, the Amazon was driven ashore at Cape Breton Island, in which she was so severely damaged that her owners thought to abandon her as a wreck. But it was not the end of the story. Alexander McBean of Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, purchased her as a derelict on October the 15th, sure something could be salvaged, return her to her former glory. At least that was the plan. A month later, McBean, though, sold the wreck to a local businessman, who then sold it again to Richard Haynes, a New York-based American mariner, in November of 1868. Haynes spent almost $9,000 of that day's money restoring the wreck after paying $1,750 for it, so he must have seen some kind of potential. He appointed himself as her captain and registered her as an American vessel with the collector of the port of New York on December of 1868. And that was when she was renamed the Mary Celeste. So for the rest of the video, we will be referring to it as the Mary Celeste. Haynes' creditors seized the ship in October of 1869, and James Winchester led a consortium from New York that purchased it again. The consortium's makeup, of course, changed multiple times over the course of the 3 years, but Winchester always held at least half a share. There is no documentation of Mary Celeste's trading activities during this time. Now, around 1872, the ship had a significant refit, and it was more than before. It cost about $10,000 and significantly increased its size. She was made 103 feet long, 26 feet wide, and 16 feet deep. A second deck was added as part of a structural modification. The ship's tonnage rose to 282.28 as a result of the work. Winchester held 6 of the consortium shares on October 29, 1872, while 2 smaller investors each held 1. Benjamin Briggs, the ship's new captain, held the remaining 4 of the 12 shares. Nathan Briggs, a sea captain, had 5 sons, including Benjamin, who was born on April 24th of 1835 in Wareham, Massachusetts. 2 of the sons became naval captains, and all but one went to sea. He took a Mediterranean honeymoon aboard his schooner Forest King after marrying his cousin, Sarah Elizabeth Cobb, in 1862. Shortly after, in September of 1865, they had a son, Arthur, and a daughter, Sophia Matilda, in October of 1870. By this time, Briggs had attained a prominent position in his field. With his seafaring brother Oliver, who had also grown weary of the nomadic lifestyle, he contemplated leaving the sea to start a more land-based business. Instead of moving forward with this project, however, they each invested their savings into a ship. Benjamin invested in Mary Celeste, and Oliver invested in Julia A. Halleck. Following her extensive New York refit, Mary Celeste was scheduled to sail to Genoa, Italy for her first voyage, which Benjamin took command of in October of 1872. He made arrangements for his wife and young daughter to go with him, leaving his school-age son at home to be looked after by his grandmother. Briggs carefully selected the crew for the journey. Albert Richardson, the first mate, had previously sailed under Briggs and was married to the niece of Winchester. About 25-year-old second mate Andrew Gilling was actually of Danish descent but born in New York. William Edward Head, a recently married steward, was hired on Winchester's personal recommendation. The four general seamen were Gottlieb Gottschall, Arjen Martens, and the brothers Volkert and Bos Lorenzen, all of whom were Germans from the Frisian Islands. Briggs wrote to his mother just before the trip, stating that he was extremely pleased with the ship and crew, and a substantial testimony characterized them as peaceable and first-class sailors, who seemed quite capable, if they continued as they had begun, Sarah Briggs had told her mother. In order to oversee the loading of the ship's 1,701 barrels of alcohol, Briggs arrived at Pier 50 on the East River in New York City on October 20th, 1872. A week later, he was joined by his wife and young daughter. Briggs wrote to his mother on Sunday, November 3rd, stating that he planned to depart on Tuesday, and that our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have fine passage. Well, fingers crossed for that. And so Mary Celeste moved into New York Harbor on Tuesday, November 5th, leaving Pier 50 with Briggs, his wife, daughter, and 7 crew members. But because of the unpredictability of the weather, Briggs chose to hold off. Sarah took advantage of the delay to write to her mother-in-law a final letter after he anchored the ship just off Staten Island. 2 days later, the weather seemed to be good enough to set sail, and Mary Celeste stepped out of the harbor and into the great Atlantic. Now, in that final letter that was written by Sarah, she had wrote, "Tell Arthur I make great dependence on the letters I shall get from him, and will try to remember anything that happens on the voyage which he would be pleased to hear." Well, unfortunately, the big, important happenings we just do not know about. Well, the Canadian brigantine De Gratia was also waiting in Hoboken, New Jersey for a shipment of petroleum bound for Genoa via Gibraltar, as Mary Celeste readied herself to set sail. Both First Mate Oliver Devoe and Captain David Morehouse were Nova Scotians, and they were not new to the game. They brought a wealth of experience, along with a stellar reputation as sailors. Because of their shared interests, some authors believe that Captain Briggs and Morehouse were acquainted, albeit briefly. According to some stories, they were just close friends who ate dinner the night before Mary Celeste left. But the only proof for this is a memory made by Morehouse's widow 50 years after the incident. And we can't really take that as gospel, can't we? Well, either way, 8 days after Mary Celeste, on November 15th, De Gratia set out for Gibraltar, taking the same old time-tested route. At approximately 1 p.m., De Gratia had arrived halfway between the Azores and the Portuguese coast. On Thursday, December 5th, or sea time rather, or Wednesday, December 4th, 1872 land time, if we're taking into account for the time differences. Now, when Captain Morehouse arrived on deck, the helmsman reported a ship at a distance of roughly 6 miles that was moving unsteadily in the direction of De Gratia. Morehouse suspected that something was amiss, because the ship's strange set of sails and her unpredictable movements. With no one on deck and no response to signals as the ship approached, he dispatched Devoe and second mate John Wright in the ship's boat to investigate. Based on the name on her stern, the two determined that it was indeed Mary Celeste, and they climbed on board, took a look around, and discovered that the ship was completely abandoned. Much of the rigging was also broken, with ropes dangling loosely over the sides, and the sails were partially set and in bad shape, with some of them missing completely. The fore and lazarette hatches were left open, their covers next to them on the deck, but the main hatch cover was still fastened. The binnacle that held the ship's compass had moved, and its glass cover was broken, and only the lifeboat on board was a tiny yawl that had reportedly been stowed across the main hatch, but was nowhere to be found. For a ship of this size, the amount of water in the hold was substantial, but not really concerning. Roughly 3.5 feet, not enough to really sink it. On the deck, a homemade sounding rod, a kind of tool for gauging the volume of water in the hold, was discovered abandoned. The ship's daily log, which was dated at 8 a.m., was discovered in the mate's cabin 9 days prior, on November 25th. Nearly 400 nautical miles, about 750 kilometers give or take, from the location where De Gratia met Mary Celeste. It noted her position at that time as off Santa Maria Island in the Azores. Although the cabin's interior was in reasonably good order, Devoe noticed that it was damp and messy from water that had gotten through the doorways and skylights. Although he discovered personal belongings in Briggs' cabin, such as a sheathed sword beneath the bed, the majority of the ship's documents and the captain's navigational aids were gone. Added to that, there was plenty of food still in the stores, but no food prepared or in the process of being prepared, and the galley equipment was all neatly stored away. The galley, by the way, being a kitchen on a ship. Now all this evidence suggests a peaceful exit from the ship via the missing lifeboat. There were no overt indications of fire or violence. Really nothing. After returning to inform Morehouse of these discoveries, Devoe made the decision to transport the abandoned ship 600 nautical miles to Gibraltar. Salvor could anticipate receiving a sizable portion of the total value of the rescued vessel and its cargo under maritime law. The precise amount would depend on the level of risk involved in the salvage. The 8-man crew of De Gratia was split between the two ships by Morehouse, who sent Devoe and 2 seasoned sailors to Mary Celeste, while he and the 4 others stayed on De Gratia. The majority of the journey to Gibraltar was in comparatively calm weather, but the progress was slow because each ship was severely undercrewed. On December 12th, De Gratia arrived in Gibraltar. Mary Celeste arrived the next morning after running into fog. The Vice Admiralty Court promptly impounded her in order to get her ready for salvage hearings. The experience of bringing the ship in was apparently so difficult that Devoe wrote to his wife, "I can hardly tell what I am made of, but I do not care so long as I got in safe. I shall be well paid for the Mary Celeste." I mean, fair enough, but he doesn't seem awfully worried about the missing crew. Ooh, maybe another part of the conspiracy has just opened up. Well, we won't talk about that just yet. Okay, alright, we'll get back to where we are before we explore that option. Right, well, under the leadership of Gibraltar's Chief Justice, Sir James Cochrane, the salvage court hearings got underway in Gibraltar on December 17, 1872. The Attorney General, Frederick Sonny Flood, who served as the Queen's Advocate General and Proctor in her Office of Admiralty, presided over the hearing. Well, according to one historian of the Mary Celeste affair, Flood was the sort of man who, once he had made up his mind about something, could not be shifted, and whose arrogance and pomposity were inversely proportional to his IQ. I don't think she likes him. Well, Flood's conviction that a crime had been committed was cemented by DeVoe and Wright's testimonies, and the New York Shipping and Commercial List adopted this view on December 21st. They had wrote in their reports, the inference is that there has been foul play somewhere, and that alcohol is at the bottom of it. People were starting to talk, it seems. John Austin, surveyor of shipping, performed an examination of Mary Celeste on Flood's order on December 23rd with the help of diver Riccardo Portinato. He discovered potential blood stains on the captain's sword and noticed cuts on either side of the bow that he believed were caused by a sharp object. Citing a vial of sewing machine oil discovered upright in its place, he stressed in a report that the ship did not seem to have been hit by severe weather. Neither Austin nor the court brought up the possibility that the vial had been replaced since the abandonment, which is, well, you'd think they would have bought that up, right? It would have been pretty easy to do. Well, according to Portinato's hull report, the ship had not run aground or been in an accident. An additional examination by a team of Royal Navy captains confirmed Austin's suspicion that the bow's cuts had been intentionally made, along with a deep mark that might have been caused by an axe. They also found stains on one of the ship's rails that might have been blood. These discoveries confirmed Flood's suspicions that the mystery was not caused by a natural disaster, but rather by human misconduct. He forwarded the reports to the London-based Board of Trade on January 22, 1873, along with his own conclusion that the crew had consumed alcohol and killed the entire Briggs family and the ship's officers in a drunken rage. To mimic a collision, they had cut the bows and then ran away in the yawl, meeting an unknowable end. Flood believed that Morehouse and his men were concealing something, namely that the log had been altered and that the Mary Celeste had been abandoned in a more eastern location. He found it hard to believe Mary Celeste could have gone so far without a crew. But then again, they were in the middle of the ocean. Well, not quite, at least, out on the open ocean near the Azores. And it would depend on how long it would have been adrift for. Well, inquiring as to when the Mary Celeste might be released to deliver her cargo, James Winchester arrived in Gibraltar on January 15th. Winchester lacked the 15 grand that Flood required as a surety. He then learned that Flood believed Winchester might have been part of the conspiracy to intentionally engage a crew that would kill Briggs and his officers. Winchester attested to Briggs excellent character during a series of acerbic exchanges with Flood on January 29th. Winchester maintained that Briggs would not have deserted the ship unless absolutely necessary. When scientific examinations of the stains discovered on the sword and other parts of the ship revealed that they were not actually blood, Flood's theories of mutiny and murder seemed to fall apart. A report from a U.S. Navy Captain Schufelt, commissioned by the American consul in Gibraltar, Horatio Sprague, dealt Flood a second blow. According to Schufelt, the marks on the bow were caused by the sea's natural action on the ship's timbers, rather than being man-made. On February 25th, Flood reluctantly moved Mary Celeste from the court's jurisdiction because he simply didn't have any hard evidence to back up his suspicions. 2 weeks later, she sailed from Gibraltar to Genoa with a crew that had been raised locally, led by Captain George Blatchford of Massachusetts. When Cochrane announced the award on the April 8th, the salvage payment issue was resolved. The amount was about £1,700, which was pretty much 1/5 of the ship and cargo's total value. This was significantly less than what was generally expected, according to one authority, considering the degree of risk involved in bringing the derelict into port. The award ought to have been twice or 3 times that sum at least. But it's only worth as much as people are willing to pay, I suppose. Even though Morehouse had stayed in Gibraltar at the court's request, Cochrane's closing remarks were a scathing indictment of his choice to send De Gratia under Devoe to deliver her petroleum cargo earlier in the hearing. According to Hicks, Cochrane's tone implied wrongdoing, guaranteeing that Morehouse and his passengers would be under suspicion in the court of public opinion forever. And that's the problem, isn't it? It's fine to be let off by the magistrate, or the judge, whatever we call it in what part of the world we're at, but that court of public opinion never really forgets. And unfortunately, most of the time you're guilty until proven guilty. The suspicions of foul play persisted, even though the theories of murder and conspiracy were not supported by any evidence in Gibraltar. Because Mary Celeste had been significantly over-insured, Flood and certain newspaper reports raised the possibility of Winchester engaging in insurance fraud for a short time. The insurance companies that had issued the policies did not launch an investigation, and Winchester was able to deny these claims. Although there's no proof of a friendship between the two captains, another theory suggests that Briggs and Morehouse conspired to divide the salvage earnings. In addition to asking why Briggs left his son Arthur if he planned to vanish forever, Hicks remarks that if Morehouse and Briggs had been planning such a scam, they would have not devised such an attention-drawing mystery. And I suppose that is a good point. Now, it's also notable to mention that ruffian pirates were active off the coast of Morocco in the 1870s. They were absolutely everywhere. The ship would have been looted, but the captain's crew and personal belongings, some of which were extremely valuable, were unharmed. Well, according to the historian John Gilbert Lockhart's 1925 theory, he suggests that Briggs simply killed everyone on board before taking his own life during an attack of religious mania. In a subsequent edition of his book, he apparently apologized and retracted this theory after he had been told off by the descendants of Briggs. Yeah, I don't know where he got his evidence for making that theory. Well, later on, Oliver Cobb, Briggs' cousin, speculated that the move of the troops to the yawl might have been a short-term safety precaution. Based on DeVoe's report on the condition of the ropes and rigging, he surmised that the yawl might have actually been attached to the ship using the main halyard, allowing the company to return to Mary Celeste once most of the danger had passed. But if the line had broken and the yawl and its passengers had been left adrift, Mary Celeste would have sailed away empty. According to Beck, it would have been nonsensical to affix the yawl to a ship that the crew was believed was going to sink or explode. After all, if it was going to sink, it would take the yawl down with it. While Briggs was also an experienced captain, according to MacDonald Hastings, who writes, if the Mary Celeste had blown her timbers, she would still have been better bet for survival than the ship's boat. Had Briggs depended on the ship's boat for survival instead of the Mary Celeste, he would have behaved like a fool, or worse, a frightened one. While most commenters concur that a very unusual and concerning situation had to have occurred for the entire crew to desert a ship that was sound, seaworthy, and well stocked. Based on the sounding rod that was discovered on deck, DeVoe ventured an explanation. He proposed that Briggs abandoned the ship following a false alarm, possibly due to a pump malfunction that gave the false impression that the ship was rapidly filling with water. The amount of water in the ship and the ragged condition of her sails and rigging could be explained by a severe water-spout strike prior to the abandonment. The crew may have overestimated the amount of water on the Mary Celeste and thought she was in danger of sinking because of the low barometric pressure created by the spout, which could have forced water from the bilges up into the pumps. It's also possible that an earthquake on the seabed would have created enough surface turbulence to harm some of the Mary Celeste's cargo and release harmful gases. And this is an interesting theory. You see, Briggs might have ordered the ship's abandonment due to growing concerns about an impending explosion. The displaced hatches indicate that an inspection, or at least an attempt at airing the ship out, had occurred. On January 24, 1886, the New York World reported on an incident involving the explosion of a ship transporting alcoholic beverages. According to the February 9, 1913 issue of the same journal, the gases that might have caused or threatened an explosion in Mary Celeste's hold came from the seepage of alcohol through a few of the more porous barrels. Oliver Cobb, Briggs' cousin, was a fervent supporter of this theory, which holds that Briggs could have ordered the ship's evacuation if the situation had been sufficiently frightening. We're talking about the smell of escaping fumes, rumblings from the hold, or perhaps even a small explosion, definitely enough to scare people away. It is possible that Briggs neglected to properly secure the yawl to the tow line in his hurry to get out of the ship before it exploded. The yawl's occupants might have been left to perish in the weather if a sudden gust of wind had blown the ship away. But while it all sounds pretty plausible, this argument's generally undermined by the cargo's generally sound condition and the discovery of the absence of explosion damage. So it sounds good, but, well, that's probably not what happened. There was an experiment, however, that was conducted as recent as 2006 that contributed to the resurrection of the explosion theory. It was done by the University College, London, by chemist Andrea Seller. Using paper cartons for the barrels, she constructed a model of the hold, then produced an explosion with butane gas that resulted in a significant blast and ball of flame. But surprisingly, the replica hold was unarmed by the fire. The researcher stated, "What we created was a pressure wave type of explosion. There was a spectacular wave of flame, but behind it was relatively cool air. No soot was left behind. There was no burning or scorching." Well, back to the late 19th century. In the decades that followed, fact and fiction began to blend together. In June of 1883, a fictitious version of the Mary Celeste story was published in the Los Angeles Times. According to the November 1906 issue of the Overland Monthly and the Out West magazine, Mary Celeste drifted off the Cape Verde Islands, approximately 1,400 nautical miles south of the actual location. Every sail was set. The tiller was lashed fast, not a rope out of place. The fire was burning in the galley. The dinner was standing untasted and scarcely cold. The log written up to the hour of her discovery. There were live chickens on board, and the first mate was a man named Briggs. Well, these are all, of course, falsehoods. Especially since they happened in living memory of when the actual, event occurred. I suppose we can't really call it a tragedy because we don't know what actually happened. For all we know, all of the sailors could have gotten off in that little lifeboat, landed on some tropical island, and lived very happy lives. That's the thing. We just don't know. Well, many commentators believe that the story in the January 1884 issue of Cornhill magazine, which guaranteed that the Mary Celeste affair would never be forgotten, was the most influential retelling. Now, you might recognize the name Arthur Conan Doyle, who was a 25-year-old ship surgeon at the time, wrote this early work. The facts in Doyle's story, J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement, were unfortunately not accurate. He changed the ship's name to Mary Celeste, and J was the captain. The fatal voyage, which was from Boston to Lisbon in 1873, was made by W. Tibbs. The title character, Jeffson, was one of the passengers on board. According to the story, a fanatic named Septimius Goering, who despises white people, had persuaded crew members to kill Tibbs and bring the ship to the coast of Western Africa. Well, except for Jeffson, who is spared because of his magical charm, which Goering and his cronies revere. The rest of the ship's company are all taken care of. I know it sounds a bit silly, doesn't it? Though Sprague was still in the US consul in Gibraltar, and sufficiently intrigued to ask whether any part of the story might be true, Doyle had anticipated that his story would never really be taken seriously. I mean, at least he's self-aware, right? And then we have the Strand magazine, who published a purported survivor's account in 1913 from a man named Abel Fosdick, who was purportedly Mary Celeste's steward. In this version, the crew was watching a swimming competition on a makeshift platform when it abruptly collapsed. Sharks ate or drowned everyone, except for Abel Fosdick himself. In contrast to Doyle's story, the magazine suggested this as a serious solution to the mystery. However, it was riddled with the most basic of errors, such as using Griggs instead of Briggs, Boyce instead of Morehouse, and so on. a plausible literary hoax from the 1920s, perpetrated by Irish writer Lawrence J. Keating, and presented as a survivor's account of a man named John Pemberton convinced a lot more people than previous retellings. It was a complicated story of murder, insanity, and cooperation with the De Gratia. But, once again, like the other stories being so fantastical, it was riddled with the most elementary of errors. But the story was presented so convincingly that the New York Herald Tribune, published on July 26, 1926, thought it was unquestionably true. Keating's hoax, according to Hastings, was an impudent trick by a man not without imaginative ability. Of course, there have been other documented instances of ships being discovered oddly or abandoned on the high seas before the Mary Celeste. Between 1840 and 1855, Rupert Gould, a naval officer of the Maritime Mystery Investigator, enumerates additional such incidents. Regardless of the veracity of these tales, people only really remember that the Mary Celeste, the ship's name, spelled Marie Celeste, has become ingrained in their consciousness as a symbol of unfathomable abandonment, but of course, it's meant to be spelled Mary. In the 1930s, two popular radio plays based upon the Mary Celeste were written by L. Tim Healy and Edgar Peach, respectively. Peach's play was actually put on stage in 1949, and there's even a whole bunch of novels that for the most part provide explanations that are natural rather than fantastic. Of course, there's probably going to be a few more films and, of course, a whole bunch of YouTube videos about the Mary Celeste in the decades to come. I actually look forward to them. Take it all with a grain of salt and just enjoy the ride. Now, many of them, I'm sure, will involve the more bizarre theories. So before we go, we'll have a quick look at the more bizarre theories that are going around. And then we have Captain R. Lucy's story in the Daily Express in 1924, that claimed that the Mary Celeste's former boatswain was her informant. And even though the registered crew list does not mention such a person, well, Briggs and his crew are portrayed as predators in this new story. They see a derelict steamer and board it, only to discover that it's empty and contains £3,500 worth of gold and silver in the safe. They use the steamer's lifeboats to reach Spain, where they decide to divide the money, leave Mary Celeste, and start new lives. It's astounding to Hastings that such an improbable tale were accepted for a while, and he claims that readers were fooled by the magic of print. And you have to remember, back in those days, a lot of people were quite fooled by it. You have a newspaper come out. Why would somebody take the trouble to lie? People hadn't quite caught on to that yet. And then there's the really out there theories. According to Chambers' Journal of September 17, 1904, it's perhaps a giant octopus or a giant squid that might have taken the Mary Celeste's entire complement off one by one, big tentacles out of the water, grabbing them like some sort of horror movie. The Natural History Museum states that a giant squid had rather been known to attack ships and can grow to 15 meters in length, but, I mean, it's pretty rare. Begg also notes that while such a creature could theoretically have killed a crew member, it would have been extremely unlikely to have captured the captain's navigational instruments and the yawl. You'd have to have very good tentacle-eye coordination. There is an undated edition of the British Journal of Astrology, which refers to the Mary Celeste story as a mystical experience and links it with the Great Pyramids of Giza, the lost continent of Atlantis, and the British Israel movement. Other explanations have proposed paranormal intervention, despite the Mary Celeste being abandoned in a totally different region of the Atlantic. The Bermuda Triangle has also been invoked because why not? And then, of course, there's the theories about alien abductions, which, of course, became a little bit more popular once aliens came into vogue in later times. But, well, we can't really take them too seriously. But in all honesty, I suppose anything is possible. Well, thank you so much for listening. I do appreciate you joining me today. This time we don't learn about a person, or a war, or even a country. We're just learning about a big old ship. That's okay. We don't always have to do biographies, don't we? So I'd like to thank my top tier supporters: Doug, Gary, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, Charlene, Christopher, and Lynn. Thank you all so much. And as always, another thank you. I wish you good night and lots of love to you all.